Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with public policy in the great state of Texas. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and today we're talking weather and climate, but from a really interesting perspective, is we welcome two former colleagues of our very own Dr. Becca Edwards. With us for today's episode are Dr. Giammanco, who serves as the Director of Standards and Data Analytics and Lead Research Meteorologist at the Institute for Building and Home Safety, and Dr. Tanya Brown-Giammanco, who serves as Director of Disaster and Failure Studies at the National Institute of Standards and Testing. We'll talk about resilience and how changes in climate impact our homes and buildings, and what we can do about it both from a consumer and advocacy perspective. I was fascinated, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. It's also a good reminder that Texas Impact has tools for you to learn more and get engaged on this and all of our other issue areas. It seems like a good time to remind folks that we have issue champion teams like our climate action team to connect folks interested in this issue, or you can find a team and connect on another issue that you care about. So check out Texas Impact's website at texasimpact.org. I'd also highlight our Texas Faith Votes resources as a great tool to engage your congregation and community and civic engagement work this election season and beyond. If you have questions about any of it, shoot me an email at scott@texasimpact.org. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Ian and Tanya. Joining us for today's conversation are two former colleagues of our very own Dr. Becca Edwards. We have with us today Dr. Giammanco, who is the Director of Standards and Data Analytics and Lead Research Meteorologist at the Institute for Building and Home Safety. Ian, you have a really long title, but I appreciate you being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And also with us today, Dr. Tanya Brown-Giammanco, who is Director of Disaster and Failure Studies at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I really do appreciate the time. I will say I'm kind of terrified for this conversation, given all the topics that we're covering today, but look forward to learning a lot from both of you. I will say you both got your start at the Texas Tech National Wind Institute, Recom Tech, where they have an interdisciplinary team looking at wind damage to buildings. And now you two embody that interdisciplinary approach, with Ian working on the meteorological side and Tanya on the engineering side. When it comes to making buildings resilient to hazards, what's the benefit of the interdisciplinary approach?
I guess Ian's given me the eye. I'll take that one. I think it's really important that, when you're looking at these kinds of events and trying to understand what's going on, you got to understand the forces that are at play. So that's the meteorological side, the hazard side. What are the forces? What are the things that really are acting to cause the damage? And then from the engineering side of things, you have to understand how the buildings are put together, how the infrastructure is put together, whatever the thing is that you're looking at. How is it put together, and how is it or is it not designed to withstand the kinds of loads that the hazard is giving it? There are other disciplines that come in as well, economics, social science as well. But I think it's really important that you get all of the forces that are at play when you're trying to understand these complex issues.
And from the meteorological, that side of the house, like one of the roles at IBHS for myself is to understand how does the weather conditions impact what the building is actually seeing? And how do we make sure that when we're doing laboratory work, it's one of the few places we can actually turn the knobs on some of these things. It's hard to do out in the real world, is can we make that test as representative of whatever that phenomenon is as best we can, whether it's a windstorm, hail events, even if you think about wildfire and how embers move around a building. And then lastly, I'd say working together at Texas Tech, that education, and Becca knows this really well, puts you in a position to solve really hard problems that require all of these disciplines. You get experience that students elsewhere may not get. And that's a key to today's problems that are very, very intertwined. So I think both of us sort of contribute, or at least would acknowledge that we wouldn't be where we're sitting without that work at Texas Tech and the faculty that were there that really championed that program.
Well, let's talk about that work a little bit. I think our listeners like to hear about why folks do things and kind of where folks come from. You both have experience working in the field, collecting data from actual storms. How'd you get started in that? How does that come into play in your current roles?
Yeah, so thinking about field research, I'll tell a little story about going back to Texas Tech. And Becca knows this really well. Both of our bosses at the time, Dr. John Schrader, I remember John and Becca asked me to go on, I think, Tropical Storm Erica in 2003. And I remember John was like, hey, can you drive a trailer? And, as a kid, I'd driven like bass boats and things like that. And these were big trailers, but I'm like, yeah, I can do that. That's going to be fun. And I tell you what, field research is one of those things where you either love it or you can't stand it. There's no in the middle. And I just had so much fun. And then it became about, you get to focus on a common goal, which is go do your experiment, do it well, do it safely, and come home. And there's all these other factors that are going on. So it's the challenge of executing an experiment in an environment where a lot of stuff is not in your control. And you have to really focus very hard on the task at hand. And I've just, over these, going now 21 years of doing this, has just been an absolute joy. It's still a challenge today, and it is one of the most rewarding things that I've been able to do. And I know Tanya has some similar sentiments, so I'll pass it over to her.
Yeah, sure. So I got my field work start at Texas Tech as well from the same person, John Schrader. I took his summer class, which at the time was a required class, and it really was all about field data collection. And I happened to be teamed up with him in his vehicle, and our job was to put down arrays of instruments in front of thunderstorms that could potentially produce tornadoes. And I like the work. I like kind of the hands-on, get out in the field, see the world, really interact with the environment. I like that aspect. But Ian kind of touched on it a little bit as well. I'm a logistics person. I like the challenge of planning. How the heck am I going to do this in a really complex environment where, maybe you don't have ideal road networks, maybe you don't have, good data or cell signals or all those kinds of things. That's where I really sort of thrive. I like doing things that are hard. I like doing things that nobody else has done before. And so it was really an attractive kind of thing to do, to work in this space that really is so complex and requires a lot of planning and a lot of decision making on the fly. It was something that I liked instantly. And so I kind of hung around and tried to help as much as I could. And the next hurricane season, there was a need for additional team members. And so I kind of folded into it easily. So that was sort of my active weather side of things. But on the other side, again, I'm a meteorologist, but at heart, I'm more of an engineer. I identify more as an engineer. That's my later discipline. But I also did lots of damage surveys, following tornadoes and hurricanes, and really understanding, again, how do the buildings themselves perform, and having both aspects. I think, they're very different kinds of research. They're really, you have a different way of conducting it and different objectives, but both of them are really interesting to me and really fascinating. And again, really drive that, making difficult choices and working in an environment that's not ideal. And that's something I really thrive on.
I love all of that. Love the stories. Also, I'll wait till we stop recording later to get all of the scoop on Becca during those days. So save those stories for after we stop recording. Tanya, talk to us some about how scientists and engineers learn from building failures. How do we take what we've learned and apply it to make buildings more resilient?
That's a really great question. And that's a lot of the focus of my work and some of the work that Ian does as well. So as we go out and conduct these post-event kind of damage surveys, we'll learn things. We'll learn things about the design, about the materials, about the way things were constructed, how they were put together, maybe how they've aged or changed over time. And really one of the ways that we try to make the most impact is by taking those lessons learned and adapting them into codes and standards and practices for, how are we going to design buildings better in the future? How are we going to construct them better in the future? And, buildings is kind of my area of specialty, but you could say the same thing about, infrastructure systems, for example. How can you take those learnings from the field where you were able to observe actual damage patterns? Can you take those observations and turn them into a proposal for a way to do it better in the future? And in our country, the codes and standards process is kind of the way that we do that. That's the bodies that sort of govern the way that we design and build within this country.
I've never thought about any of this. I love all of that. Ian, tell us about how IBHS simulates hazards in a laboratory. What kinds of hazards can you simulate? And are there a few favorite insights you've learned from this work?
Yeah, one of the unique things about the IBHS facility is a full-scale wind tunnel that you can actually fit two side-by-side, two-story homes inside. This was really the brainchild of Dr. Tim Reinhold that was one of the sort of godfathers of wind engineering and helped bridge that gap between engineering and atmospheric science too, along with many others. It was Tim's idea after Hurricane Andrew, when we saw all these wind-induced building failures, that you have to look at the building as a system. All the pieces and parts and how the wind loads interact with those work as a system. In typical wind tunnel testing, we're looking at the loads on a model, a scaled-down model, and just trying to estimate what are the forces pushing on the pieces of that model. Well, in real buildings, we have nails and screws and, in good places, we have straps and clips and all that stuff. And those interact with each other differently. We also have installation errors. We have contractors who may not follow the code, or we may have places. I'll give Habitat for Humanity a great example. They put more nails into homes in typical construction than would be required because people love driving nails. And that's a great thing. So IBHS took Tim's idea as our first chief engineer. He designed the facility. It's 105 fans, and it's adaptable now to multiple perils. So it's not just wind. You can do a wildfire ember attack simulation in there. You can actually do a full-scale hail simulation in there, and that's the uniqueness. But we also do a lot of smaller scale work on material performance. Like, how does your asphalt shingles perform in all this stuff? So it's taking full scale, taking it small scale, and bridging this gap between sort of foundational science to applied research, and then ultimately, as Tanya mentioned, get this stuff into our building code. So from a surprise, I don't know about surprises, but I think the favorite part, and her and I, we used to work together at IBHS, was developing our hail research program. I think a lot of people do not realize that hailstorms cause 60 to 80% of the damage from severe thunderstorms every single year. It's not tornadoes. It's not the wind aspect. It's hail. And that's a lot of roof replacements, a lot of siding damage over and over and over again. And so we were asked, as sort of with the meteorological background, hey, go start a hail research program. It's costing the insurance industry really billions and billions of dollars. And we just had no preconceived notions. We were not from that world, no conceptual blocks. We just started tackling this problem. And over time, it grew to being one of the kind of impetus for a renaissance in hail research, all the way to a multi-agency field project that's coming and a new testing standard. All of this simply by looking at a problem that nobody had really thought about and applying our background with this multidisciplinary work toward really trying to tackle something that people didn't realize was, hey, this is one really bad and costing us a boatload of money every single year. So that's been sort of my favorite part, is just that entire process of building a program.
It's interesting that you mentioned hail because I had Becca on a couple weeks ago on the program talking about climate issues, and my community in particular has been hammered over the course of the last few months. And we live at the front of our neighborhood, and so every time there's a little bit of hail, we end up with like 18 people asking if they can get on our roof to go look at the damage. And that's happened so many times over the course of the last year, which brings us to the idea that this is happening more often. And Becca shared an article from Jeff Masters in Climate Central that said that much of the increase in property damage, particularly along the coast, which is, spoiler, Texas has a coast, has been due to increasing exposure. And that's what's caused property insurance to start having challenges. He also says that climate change is in the background of that, and that that will start to have a bigger impact on the rate of property loss that we see in vulnerable areas. Talk to us about your thoughts on the interplay of increased exposure and increased risk due to climate change.
Yeah, right now, what's driving the really escalating losses, both from hurricanes, tropical cyclones, or severe convective storms, with hail driving a lot of that, is what was coined by Walker Ashley, Victor Gensini, and Steven Schrader, the bullseye effect, which is simply our communities have gotten bigger. Our bullseye that we're throwing darts at, which is our storms, has gotten just bigger. So you take an area, let's look at hail for the area north of Dallas. Good example, from, say, the north side of the Dallas metro up through Denton. There's a joke about how, like, it's death, taxes, and hail in Denton County.
Right.
Well, a lot of that area was farmland 20, 30 years ago, or ranch land. Today, it's dense suburban neighborhoods where the probability of hail hitting a home compared to yard and grass, the chances of it hitting your roof are way higher than it hitting anything else at this point. So now we've put not only bigger homes, we peaked in home sizes in 2015. Our median home size in the United States was over 2,500 square feet. So we've built bigger. And there's that lag, right? As the hazard catches up, we've built bigger on smaller lots and crammed it together. That is a massive increase in material that can be damaged by these storms. So that's just masking the climate element right now completely. Like, it's just overwhelming it. And under that, as Jeff says, there's the climate element. And especially if we look at the tornado aspect, which is the biggest fingerprint of climate change right now that we can detect, is shifting sort of the frequency of tornadoes into an area into the southeast U.S., really just moving it all eastward. There's a lot more population density. So now we've taken the hazard, the climate element has turned the geographic knob into a place that's already more susceptible to that problem. Hail is a similar thing. If we shift it geographically, maybe we move it north and east. That's a little bit of what the sort of latest research shows. Now we're putting places like St. Louis, Chicago, you can even start seeing Detroit, some of the bigger cities of the central U.S. right in the line of fire, per se, for big hail events. But again, though, if you look at really the last 20 years, the hail across the I-35 corridor from Wichita, Oklahoma City, to Dallas, to San Antonio, to Austin is just driving immense damage. And everybody knows that area from an urban corridor is just filling in. I mean, there's almost not going to be a gap between Dallas and Fort Worth and Waco. I mean, if you just think about going south on I-35. So this is the problem that we're presented with. And if you think about our performance of building materials, our codes and standards is not keeping up with that. And we're seeing losses in especially for severe weather. The property insurance world is bearing a large portion of that cost, as are we as homeowners, having to deal with paying for premiums and things like that. So, and having to pay deductibles. It's all just sort of caught up to us. And that's unfortunate. So it's kind of a race, right, against resilience and climate. So we're racing against the bullseye effect, and we're racing against the climate aspect that's right behind us. So I think that's just the problems we're facing today.
We've talked a lot about hail, and you might have already answered this question, but in addition to hail, Texas has kind of been in the thick of it for a whole lot of different climate-related losses over the course of the last 5 years. Between the hail, hurricanes, we've flooded lots of times from just random rainstorms coming through, the ice storms. Any other hazards that have caused significant loss here in Texas?
Well, I think that the one that sort of jumped out as that made people stand up that we didn't think about readily was the winter weather event, is what happens when you have an infrastructure failure combined with winter weather. And I'll let Tanya jump in about sort of cascading perils, but that was a great example of a couple of different factors came together. And our codes in Texas are not designed for cold weather. Our building energy codes are really focused on keeping our buildings cool in the summer. So, why not let Tanya jump in about this sort of compounding hazard problem that sort of reared its head in the winter space in Texas not that long ago.
Yeah, I think that was one that caught a lot of people off guard. Not that those kind of events can't happen in Texas, but again, I think Texans are usually more on the lookout for tornadoes, hail, and hurricanes, maybe even wildfires these days. But those kind of big winter storms, there's sort of this lack of memory almost that people don't really set themselves up to be able to handle those kinds of events because they just don't really occur there that often. But we are seeing a bit of a shift in that kind of space. So I think, one of the lessons maybe for people to think about is, what's happened in the past is not necessarily representative of what's going to happen in the future. So even though, your community may have never experienced X, Y, or Z event before, it really might start experiencing those kinds of things as we have, some of these new events in new areas, but also, again, the building stock and the infrastructure that's there probably wasn't originally designed to handle it. And those things are aging. So you kind of have a compounding of multiple things going on with people not really having the previous experience in handling certain kinds of events. And the infrastructure and buildings surrounding us not being designed to take it either. So it really kind of compounds multiple problems all together in one.
Yeah, I want to come back to that building codes issue in just a second, but I know one of the concerns that people do have with all of the increased risks is the issue of property insurance. And we're all hearing that there are some property insurance providers that are pulling out of some high-risk markets, including parts of Texas. Given the work that you're both doing, is the insurance industry interested in reducing loss by improving building resilience?
So the industry as a whole, the IBHS laboratory was actually built with that premise, is to try to bend down this loss curve. One of the biggest problems we face, as I mentioned, this growing bulk of buildings that are susceptible, is managing the potential loss scenario. And right now, we've unfortunately haven't been able to get enough resilience as a norm into the marketplace. So what insurers are sort of left with is this kind of punitive action where I have to just manage my portfolio. And each carrier does it very, very differently. So a national carrier, the big names, are going to treat their portfolio very differently. They can manage that because of it. Now, a regional carrier, if you think about maybe the farm bureaus, things like that, they may be stuck dealing with a particular hazard and they don't have a choice. So they're going to make very different business decisions than some of the bigger carriers. But as we look at resilience, you see places that most carriers these days offer discounts, some of which have gotten very good on the coast for IBHS fortified construction. So they're trying to make those nudge factors for people to do that. The problem is resilience is slow. There's nothing fast about this. I think about the fortified program, which now has, I think, about a quarter of single-family homes in Mobile and Baldwin counties in Alabama are built to that standard. That took over a decade to get, and that's fast. So you have all this lag in construction, codes keeping up, and growth that sort of come to a head, and you're left with, what do we do? I'm trying to balance portfolios. So right now, there's not a whole lot of options. We're hoping as codes come up and things like the fortified grant programs that a lot of states are starting to implement will change the game. And I think it's gonna, but we're gonna have to sort of fight through this next decade to maybe 15, 20 years to let those resilience measures do their thing. And that's the problem. It's why it's so important that this stuff is in place before the communities of tomorrow are built. I will say a great example, though, of this, Florida, following Hurricane Ian. So the Florida building code now basically requires if you put on a roof, it mimics the IBHS fortified roof standard. So there's about 150,000 roofs that got damaged in Hurricane Ian. That's 150,000 new roofs that are built to a higher standard. So as codes do their thing, they're going to start compounding on each other. But unfortunately, us as homeowners, that's going to take a while for us to see that impact on the bottom line. So unfortunately, we're in an environment where we have to move this bar faster. We have to move this wheel faster to try to help ourselves. So that's just kind of the space we're in today. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer of how to do this fast. So I'll let Tanya, you may have some insights on how we can move the codes bar from a process and getting science in there quicker to try to combat some of this as well.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, in the space that I work in, codes and standards are the way that we try to get things happening, but those are slow processes as well. Some of the standards that really form the backbone of our building codes, they're only reissued once every 6 years. So if we learn something new today, right now, it's almost too late to get it into the next version because they're already working through the cycle, and the next cycle will be 6 years away. So while moving those things forward, is certainly important, there is a delay. There's a time lag. So it will be a while before, our building stock will really reflect some of the strong learnings that we're getting from all the different kinds of studies done in this space. It's just an unfortunate byproduct, but it's still important to keep going. We can't say that the delay means, why bother? That's not the right answer either. We have no reason to believe that the events are going to start being any easier to handle. So it's kind of like we need to get started right now. We can't wait. We can't delay moving codes and standards forward.
And I'd say to that too, it's important that we don't need to normalize damage. Saying that we just have to accept it is not a solution. And that is not going to help us. That is not going to help the disruption part that comes with these events. And Becca knows this all too well. Our old boss, John would always say, we're trying to make these things a bump in the road to society. We cannot normalize this damage. If we do that, we will never get there. And I think it's important when we see places, even in where we think something is good and performance isn't what it should be. I'm going to take recently Hurricane Francine. Watching some buildings come apart in Houma, Louisiana, the design wind speed is 140 miles an hour down there, not 98. That should not have happened. So what are the factors that led to that? We cannot normalize that. That's not okay that building came apart in that kind of conditions when it's designed to be better.
Unless they were older, then, it may not have been designed to handle that. I don't know what building you're talking about, but...
That's the turnover factor. But when you look at newer construction, Louisiana put in their state code in 2008. So anything past 2008 that was built should perform. And the question, did it? Florida, great example, Hurricane Ian used that one, where buildings built to their modern code did perform, did stand up. So they have a great system of protection that comes with it. So that's the kind of nuance where we have to have building stock turnover. And when it does, we need to have those protections available to be used.
All right. You talked Florida, you talked Louisiana. Talk to us about Texas. Are there ways building codes could improve here in the great state of Texas to make property more resilient to hazards?
Yeah, Texas, unfortunately, it jumps in with a resounding yes.
That was quick.
Yeah, Texas in the IBHS Rating the States program has historically fallen really in the bottom of the hurricane-prone coastal states. And here, I'll sort of explain why that is. Texas is a home rule state. Code jurisdiction and adoption is left to the local level. So there are many places. Texas does have a state recommended code. However, that is not required to be uniformly enforced across the state, which is different from Louisiana that has that, Florida, the Florida Building Code. There's other states that have that as well. South Carolina is another one that has that, Virginia. But Texas leaves it to the local jurisdictions. And one of the things we saw after Hurricane Andrew, I'm going to use that as an example, Florida thought they kind of had this, but they let local jurisdictions sort of amend codes and move them around. So you had 211 different code jurisdictions. They all had their own version of the building code. And you could pick and choose between like 3 or 4 different code things, like actual standards. And so when you looked at what happened, there was 21 different variants of the building code in South Florida at the time of Hurricane Andrew that would have impacted wind performance. Well, what happens when the builder doesn't know what code they're building to, the inspector doesn't know what code they're inspecting to, there's no consistency, they just don't do anything, and they don't do anything at all, and performance suffers. So that's the challenge and why we sort of preach consistent building code adoption. In Texas, unfortunately, there are places in unincorporated areas, even the Houston metro 20, 30 years ago, that didn't have a code. Sugarland, great example. A lot of that early growth happened under no code. So who knows what was going on? Brazoria County right now, same thing. No code until these communities become their own entities and can adopt one. So you have a lot of these unincorporated areas of counties that don't have an enforced code. And so who knows what in the world's going on? And we know from Hurricane Andrew and past events that is absolutely one of the ingredients of the recipe for catastrophe. And that is an unfortunate aspect. So from IBHS, and I'll let Tanya sort of talk about how they advocate in the code space. We want a statewide uniformly enforced code, but if we're not going to get there, the local jurisdictions have to pick up the slack and make sure there are no gaps.
Yeah, I think I'll echo a bit of what Ian said. There's places in the same county that Fort Worth is in that don't have a code, kind of removed from Fort Worth itself, but same county. The risk is not different, whether you're in the city or in the county. The risk is nearly identical. So, that's one thing that becomes problematic. Another thing that Ian sort of alluded to, but I'll make sure to emphasize, is that states or local jurisdictions, depending on how you're doing it, have the opportunity to modify or amend or change the sort of nationwide code, which is governed by the International Code Council. And oftentimes those amendments actually take out the things that might be most important. And I'll give you an example that I just happen to know kind of top of head. There was a point in time where the codes in Oklahoma, they had a code, which is great, but they amended out all the tornado related things, which was you're kind of thinking, Oklahoma tornadoes, like they sort of go hand in hand. So It's important that, the things that are in the model code are there for a reason. And it's important when states are evaluating what changes they want to make to the model code, that they're not taking out something that really should be in their jurisdiction based on the hazards that they face. So, that's another place that we have to kind of be conscious of and be aware of how those kinds of changes can really have big trickle-down effects.
So I want to sort of build on this too. Is homeowners, like, we don't think about this stuff, right? We want to, if you talk to a typical homeowner, most people are going to say, hey, my home's built to the best thing there could be. And unfortunately, in too many places across the U.S., that's not the case. And Tanya, we're sitting in our home that was built a couple of years ago, and there was a process with the builder. And I want Tanya to kind of talk about that as an example of how we could craft, or at least knew what to ask. But at some point, you shouldn't have to be people like us to get the stuff you want. So, Tanya, we just dealt with this a couple of years ago, but how does that work for like a normal, like a non-science nerd or non-wind engineer? How does that work?
For the rest of us.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. We had the benefit when we built this house of, I could look at the drawings and I could see which code it was built to, and I could see what was being modified if there was anything. But your average homeowner is not in that space. They're a lot. I think a lot of people really make the assumption, the house that I live in or the apartment I live in, whatever it is, whether you're renting or owning, is the most expensive thing in my life on a monthly basis. So of course the quality is good. And unfortunately, that's just not always a safe assumption. Everybody shouldn't have to be an engineer and to make sure that the place that they live is safe. We need other ways to ensure that, because believe me, even for someone who's done this as long as me, it's not always easy to go in and read all the code documents and stuff. It's lots of jargony and it's complicated and it references all these other things that you got to look at. And, we need our communities to be able to make decisions about where they live and their family safety without having to read the building code, quite frankly.
Yeah, so it sounds like I always like to give our listeners homework assignments. It sounds like there are kind of two sets of homework assignments. Number one is for folks to check out their own home and their own property, and number two is to have some conversations with policymakers, which our folks love to do. But from the personal, like the homeowner standpoint, what's the homework assignment there? How can we reduce our own personal risk besides like paying attention if we're building a new home?
Well, I want to give a shout out to if folks for homework assignment. So go look up the code that your home is built under. The Federal Alliance for Safe Home, it's called FLASH, has a tool called Inspect to Protect, and you can actually put in your address, and they'll tell you what code regime you're under. The best protections, and Tanya will echo this, are built under our modern codes, which is really 2002 to later. Those are the homes that have a lot of benefits from the wind mitigation standpoint that was developed even way before that, back in 1988. That whole framework came about. And so, folks, Inspect to Protect, go look up your own home, see what you're at. But I wanted to, you got two things really that give you a great chance to strengthen your home. One is when you re-roof. I always talk about folks go to a fortified roof. It gives you enhanced protection from wind-driven rain through the sealed roof deck part when your shingles come off, and they will come off, especially as they get older. And you get extra nailing pattern, stronger nails that reduce uplift on the roof decking itself. And then there's details about the edge that can keep those, keep your roof cover intact to minimize severe damage. It's the best chance you get. And then the other one is garage doors. We'd advocate for somebody if you're replacing a garage door. Garage doors are terrible weak points. And I'm going to actually turn it to Tanya because she's done the work on this to talk about why that is one of those places you, one, can make a difference, and two, it is a massive vulnerability on a home.
Yeah, garage doors are sort of my pet peeve. Like anytime anyone brings one up around NIST, it's always like, oh, don't get Tanya started. So my pet peeve with garage doors kind of came about because doing all these damage surveys, I always notice, gosh, these garage doors fail all the time. And then once they fail, like the building is in even worse shape. So, looking side by side, two houses, one has a garage door that failed and one didn't fail. And the additional damage was so drastically different. So I started kind of on a crusade to look at this a little bit, and brought in one of our other Texas Tech former colleagues, who's now a professor at the University of Illinois, and worked with him and his students. And we did a big assessment that really showed the very strong and convincing relationship between garage damage and other structural damage. So, you think about a garage door itself, if you lose the door, in the grand scheme of things from a cost perspective, it's $1,000, something in that ballpark. Like it's not the end of the world. But what happens when you lose a garage door in a windstorm is you allow all of the air, all the wind to come into that area. And what happens is you create a pressure buildup. We call it internal pressurization. And it actually causes the walls to push out and the roof to push up. And so what we were seeing really with that expanded damage is once you lost the garage door, you had a pretty high likelihood of losing your roof, where like the whole chunk of the roof, not just the shingles, but the whole roof structure would come off. And as you can imagine, that's not an easy repair. It's not a cheap repair. It will keep you out of your home for a really long time while that kind of repair is done. And in some cases, it may be so severe that it's not even cost effective to save the home and you just have to demolish it. So, you take this component, and the reason it's so vulnerable, it's big. It's a big sail area, and it doesn't have really strong attachment. So you press on it, and what do you know? It folds, and then all this wind comes in, and now you have a catastrophic failure. So garage doors are something that really actually do have a very high statistical correlation with roof structure and wall damage. So, we've proved that in that study that I did with our colleague Frank Lombardo, and additional studies have shown it as well. It is one of those places where choosing a garage door that is wind rated, that has the thicker panels and has the stiffening bars and has the better anchorage and attachment to the garage itself, really can make a huge difference. And it's not a $0 investment. I mean, obviously there's an increased cost, but it's not like thousands of dollars. It's like a few $100 increase. So, given how big of a difference it can make in performance, it really, really is an investment that is worth making in places that experience strong windstorms, which of course your listeners do all the time.
Garage doors are my pet peeve, is a phrase I never thought I would hear on this podcast, but I'm definitely going to look at my garage door when I get home today.
You should see a sticker on the back of it, at a minimum, that has a bunch of PSF numbers and things on it. If it doesn't,
if it's new,
if it's
old, it won't have that.
Yeah.
Just know that for like the next month, anytime I go home, I'm now going to be thinking of this conversation when I look at my garage door. So thanks for putting that in my mind.
We stare at way too many roofs these days, too. I talk to all of our
walk around the neighborhood and look at the roof.
I talk to all of our young scientists about that all the time. How many roofs you look at?
We're gonna be having some fun driving around the neighborhoods this week. All right, last one. The second homework assignment related to policymakers. What do you recommend for folks in terms of homework for visiting with their policymakers?
So I think, the start, one, it's advocate for a consistent code adoption and enforcement. But the one place I will say from sort of the IBHS perspective that we have seen success is states putting in grant programs for to help folks retrofit to a fortified roof. I'll give an example, up to the north in Oklahoma. Oklahoma's had the insurance discounts for fortified for almost a decade. And I could, for a long time, could count the number of designations just on two hands. But now they've put in the grant program. And those grants, while they don't actually represent the bulk of the designations that come, they are like turning an on switch for awareness. It lets consumers know. It helps from the state level to advocate for those things. And it does just start the process and start that ramp up. We've seen it in Louisiana. Alabama did it a long time ago and is the best representation of a wind mitigation success story I think there is. But when you're talking to policymakers, one, it's code. But two, look at these grant programs because they do change that awareness spectrum. And that when you couple it with the things like the insurance discounts, things can start changing faster than perhaps we've settled for in the past. But that's sort of our perspective is help those policymakers, one, understand the value of uniform code adoption, but in the absence, go to things like these grant programs. They can do amazing things from an awareness perspective on resilience.
And I'll kind of emphasize again, the importance of codes and standards, and to the extent that, the public has a voice with their policymakers and can kind of advocate for, demand. We want better buildings. We want safer buildings for our families. There's been recent legislation going on in North Carolina where the legislation has actually kind of said, we're not going to be adopting any new codes for some extended period of time. And, that's problematic as somebody who might live in that community. You may not understand all the nuances behind that, but basically your lawmakers are saying, we're going to take a pause on adopting the newest science and the newest engineering. And while those kinds of things, are not currently happening in Texas, they can happen. So sort of, advocating for yourself as a consumer, there's nothing wrong with that. You have a voice for a reason. And, if resiliency is important to you, you got to make it known, especially in places where there isn't a code or where maybe the code is behind or certain things have been modified out. We all have some responsibility to understand how we can affect our own safety, and codes and standards are certainly a way to do it. So make sure your governments know that that's something that you want for your family.
And lastly on that, you often hear the cost argument as a way to sort of pump the brakes. But a lot of the things we've talked about, the cost from if you look at it within your 30-year mortgage, I mean, you're in the pennies kind of space for this stuff. And there's often, you'll hear doom and gloom thrown around about this will just obliterate the housing. None of that's ever happened. In the history of the Florida building code going to the code, more Oklahoma going to their enhanced code after the 2013 EF5, none of the doom and gloom has ever happened. And if you look at it, our real estate market is what really drives the fluctuations and costs of homes. I mean, the volatility that comes with real estate, I mean, right now is a great example of that. So as homeowners and advocates that we can be, that doom and gloom doesn't happen. And two, it's cut through the noise, that these things can work. They are highly cost effective. And there is the added benefit of a lot of the insurance incentives that are now coming online that really can pay itself back. If you look at a coastal home with a fortified roof, I mean, you can get your money back in terms of discounts within that 3 to 6, 7 year window, which is great. You know, when you do that, that's even social scientists, some people become very willing to take that on. And as performance will show, I think you're going to get even better products out of that. So that's where we sit today. But I would encourage, just get involved. Just start talking. Just remember, hey, I can have a voice and make a difference.
I love all of that, friends. I appreciate y'all taking the time today. Any closing thoughts or shameless plugs before we go?
Get yourself a good garage door.
Knew that was coming.
Yeah, but I'll for folks interested in some of these enhancements, go to fortifiedhome.org, or if you're in a space that deals with wildfireprepared.org. That's got all the IBHS information on these enhancements, and then you can find all the tips and everything from the little stuff to these big things that we've talked about. At the end of the day, when it comes to the resilience space, take a step. The first step is usually the one that gets you on a path going. And who knows, maybe step 22 is a fortified roof. But just start thinking about this stuff. Because as Tanya mentioned, there ain't no evidence that any of this stuff is going away. And it's not going to get better. So we have to deal with, one, the weather we face today, and then the weather we're going to face, that our kids may face in 20, 30 years. And we have got to start this adaptation process.
Well, step one is clearly talk to your policymakers if we're taking a step, and step two is apparently a garage door, or I'm afraid Tanya will come through the screen at me. So I really do, Tanya, Ian, really do appreciate both y'all for your work and for your time today. This has been amazing. Thanks again.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a fun to be a part of this.
I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Ian and Tanya. I know for sure I'll have homework when I go home today to check out my house. And I hope you learned something today and are able to find some time to consider how you can be a better consumer and use the information to have conversations with elected officials about how we can encourage better planning for the increased climate risks we're all facing. As always, Texas Impact has tools for you to stay engaged, and I would again remind you of the opportunity to join Texas Impact's Climate Action Team. And I especially hope everyone is using the Texas Faith Votes resources. You can find those and so much more at texasimpact.org. While you're there, I hope you'll take a moment to sign up to be a member of Texas Impact. Your membership supports this podcast and all of the work to engage Texans of faith to advocate for a more just and equitable Texas. If you have questions about any of it, please reach out. You can reach me at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, I think it's time to close out this episode. So remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Attman, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.